Afternoon, everybody. Just add to Kevin's welcome to everybody for the continuation of our Brexit clinics, and this one now very much a post-Brexit clinic. As in previous occasions, we're going to be running a number of presentations with myself kicking off and then calling on colleague Katie Hayward and Vivian Grady to talk through various different aspects about where we are with the Brexit process, and obviously very much where things stand with the protocol. We'll run through the three presentations and then we'll obviously open up the floor for questions and comments, and hopefully have a bit of discussion around some of the issues which we're facing at the moment. So you're all very welcome. What I want to do is provide an overview of where things stand with the implementation of the protocol, where we are with Brexit, because obviously a lot has been happening in recent weeks and the last couple of months. It's probably useful if we just review a number of those developments. Okay, what I want to start off with is the obvious point in many respects that, okay, 1st of January was real Brexit. The transition period which the UK was in following its departure from the EU at the end of January last year came to an end on the 31st of December. And as a consequence of that, the UK left the customs union, left the EU internal market, and left the EU cooperation arrangements. Okay, we did get a deal last year, very late last year, the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and that provisionally came into force on the 1st of January this year. I say provisionally because although it got approved by the UK Parliament very late in 2020, it still has only got provisional agreement within the EU. We're still waiting for the European Parliament to sign off on the agreement. That's expected to be done in March, early April. Okay. Also, obviously, what happened on the 1st of January this year is the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland came into force. And whereas the UK has left the customs union and internal market, the protocol means to say that Northern Ireland remains subject to the EU customs code and de facto in the EU internal market for goods. And we're probably all aware of the consequence of this, that there have been increased formalities, checks and controls on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Okay, so what I'll say is a few words about the arrangement which has been put in place for the UK and the EU as a whole, this UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. As you probably remember, it was the announcement that it had been concluded came on the evening of Christmas Eve, and then there was a very, very rapid scrutiny of it by MPs before they signed off in time for it to come into force on the 1st of January this year. Key point to say about the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is that it's not as ambitious as we necessarily thought it was going to be when the withdrawal agreement was concluded and when it was agreed that there would be a protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. Okay. Over the last year or so, the aspirations of the UK government have diverged from those expressed in the political declaration that was agreed in October 2019. And instead what we have is a relatively thin trade and cooperation agreement. Its key focus is on zero tariff, zero quota trade between the UK and the EU, but as you'll probably be very much aware from all the various media reports of the disruption to trade between the UK and the EU since the 1st of January, it doesn't provide for regulatory alignment. It does not provide for the removal of non-tariff barriers on the movement of goods. Okay, that said, it does cover all products, and it is zero tariff, zero quota. There are those tariffs or quota on the trade between the UK and the EU. It doesn't, however, cover services. There are a number of things outstanding that still need to be addressed in the relationship. It doesn't involve an adequacy decision on data protection, or that is coming. And there's also issues in there which are which obviously it does address in terms of access to some EU programs, so Horizon program for research, but it doesn't include things like Erasmus, which from a university perspective is quite important. There are a number of areas which are listed for further dialogue and discussion, but certainly if you to put this in the sort of hierarchy of relationships which the EU has with European countries, it's one of the least developed forms of relationship which exist. That said, it exists. There is a framework there for a lasting partnership, and indeed the agreement sets up a whole range of mechanisms for ongoing dialogue and discussion between the UK and the EU across a range of areas. There are also provisions for various periodic reviews for the arrangements. Yeah, as I say, it's a framework. It is in place, and the UK has therefore avoided the possibility of a no-deal Brexit at the end of, or no-deal exit from the transition period at the end of last year. Okay, so that's some comment there on the trade and cooperation agreement. In terms of the UK-EU relationship, obviously a key element of that is also the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, which, as I said already, puts Northern Ireland in a different position to the rest of the UK, at least in terms of the movement of goods. Northern Ireland is in the customs, de facto in the customs territory of the EU and its internal market for goods. The consequence of this is that Northern Ireland finds itself in a very unique position vis-a-vis the EU. Yes, it is still very much part of the United Kingdom constitutionally, but because of this arrangement under the protocol, it is engaged in elements of European Union-based integration around the internal market for goods, around the customs union. And moreover, because of the 1998 agreement, that puts it in a unique relationship with Ireland, and we have a rather interesting position at the moment for Northern Ireland. A key question for us all is, how is this relationship, this unique relationship, going to work out over the coming years? We obviously see various tensions around it at the moment because the position is unique, and it is one which is contested by a number of forces. As I say, be interesting to see how that plays out in due course. What we're obviously interested in is the UK-EU relationship as a whole, what's happening around that, but very much with a focus on the Northern Ireland dimension to it. Okay, so Northern Ireland is in this very interesting position under the protocol, and we'll see how that plays out. Importantly for that position is the fact that there is a UK-EU trade and cooperation agreement. It is important that that agreement exists because it does mean to say that some of the potential frictions on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland have been removed. So, for example, there's no tariffs, there's no quotas, but we have to remember that the trade and cooperation agreement is a fairly thin agreement. Consequently, it doesn't provide for free movement of services, doesn't provide for mutual recognition of professional qualifications, for example. There's no regulatory alignment. And that does cause problems or challenges and problems for the implementation of the protocol. The nature of the trade and cooperation agreement does little to really soften that Irish Sea border, which is established by the protocol. But also I think it's worth remembering, because there's no free movement of services, no mutual recognition, it does little to facilitate north-south movement in the area of services, because Northern Ireland, despite the protocol, is not part of the internal market as far as services is concerned, or the free movement of people, although that is partly mitigated, at least if you're a UK or Irish national, by the existence of the common travel area. Okay. Important also to say is that the trade and cooperation agreement, as is at the moment, is just the beginning of the relationship. And what's going to be really interesting to see over the next number of years is the extent to which the evolution of that relationship either addresses some of the concerns which exist around the implementation of the protocol and minimize some of the frictions, or if the UK does pursue high levels of divergence from the EU, whether the implementation of the trade and cooperation agreement actually exacerbates some of those tensions and frictions. Okay, so focus a little bit on the protocol. December was important for the UK-EU relationship because the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was concluded, but it was also important because a number of key decisions were taken around the operation of the protocol. And these related to a number of issues around export declarations in terms of the movement of goods from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, arrangements for levels of support for agriculture and fisheries, the whole question of commercial processing and goods being or not at risk of onward movement from Great Britain through Northern Ireland into the EU market, arrangements around an authorised trader scheme for goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, and also the evolution and monitoring of the protocol. The protocol is a dynamic entity insofar as new EU acts can be added to it by joint agreement of the UK and the EU, and a number of acts were added, but also 2 were actually removed. And it also, we've got the whole question of, okay, how is the protocol going to be implemented, and what monitoring arrangements are going to be in place for EU officials in Northern Ireland. What was also agreed, as we probably heard from the news over the last number of weeks, is a number of grace periods. So implementation of the protocol's requirements as regards export health certificates was postponed until 31st of March. Implementation of prohibitions and restrictions on movement from GB to NI of meat products postponed until the 30th of June. And the UK has been given until 31st of December to ensure that the medicine acquis is fully being addressed in its relationship between the UK and the EU and Northern Ireland's position within that. And also a grace period was agreed for the application of customs requirements on parcels. That will come to an end currently on the 31st of March this year. Important to note, as part of that part of the adoption of the grace periods and some of those agreements around the operation of the protocol, that there are various conditions attached to it, and these have come to the fore in the, or more, be given more prominence in some of the EU's expressed concerns about implementation of the protocol in the last few days. So export declarations, they needed to be replaced with an equivalent means of capturing the data on the movement of goods from Northern Ireland into Great Britain. The not at risk goods, you had the authorised trader system being introduced, but also there were arrangements there about commitments to those products having their end consumers in Northern Ireland, and also providing data on the flows. And there'd be a possibility of the whole system being up for review before 1st of August 2023. In terms of export health certificates, there needs to be Northern Ireland specific labelling and also ongoing compliance by the UK with the EU acquis. A similar set of provisions, conditions around meat products as well. Okay, so protocol had key decisions taken in December about its implementation, and that implementation in full began on the 1st of January this year. As we're probably all aware, that's not been without its difficulties. Arguably, a lot of those were foreseen, were anticipated, even if discussion of them wasn't necessarily forthcoming, particularly on the part of the UK government. Moreover, the situation was exacerbated by the delays in a lot of the information coming forward for businesses in particular about the arrangements to be put in place. Part of that was because the agreement on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement came so late in the day. But we are where we are. Protocol is being implemented, and that is resulting in greater number of checks, particularly on the movement of goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. We've also seen clearly the political opposition which exists to what is seen as an Irish Sea border emerging as a consequence of the protocol. And that has obviously been reflected in the whole series of political debate, and indeed in some cases outrage about the position that Northern Ireland finds itself in under the protocol. As I said, a lot of decisions came very late. Got a copy there of some guidance which was produced by the UK regarding the sending of parcels from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. As you see, that was only published on the 31st of December. In the context of having such late notification of arrangements, it's not surprising that there have been difficulties in the implementation of the protocol. Okay, What 1st of January and the period since has also realised is that there are some issues which possibly weren't flagged enough previously for people to understand what the implications of the protocol were. So we've got what's been referred to as the problematic Ps, question about movement of pets from GB into Northern Ireland, what's happening around parcels, and the restrictions which exist on things like seed potatoes, and the movement of plants and plant products into Northern Ireland from Great Britain. The absence of UK-EU alignment on what's called SPS, and Katie will talk more about this, Katie and Vivian will talk more about this later, causes problems, causes frictions, and also means that, say, there's certain things that we've not been able to see move from Great Britain to Northern Ireland since the 1st of January. Now, what we also know is that the reaction to this has been quite vocal in many respects, and there's obviously been calls for the UK to trigger what's Article 16 and adopt various safeguard measures because of the disruption that the 1st of January has led to, that being the UK leaving the internal market and the customs union, but also then the implementation of the protocol. We've probably all become far too familiar with the language of Article 16 because of the various debates that have occurred, notably in the Commons, with various calls being made on the UK government to trigger it. There was pushback on that because the safeguards are meant to be used very much as a last resort and only if there's essentially unforeseen circumstances. Now, I think we're getting to a stage where people were beginning to realise that Article 16 was not the route to address the issues which were being raised. It needed to be seen as something of a last resort. But then we had the EU, or the European Commission, signalling over its restrictions on the export of vaccines, that it was intending to trigger it and restrict exports of vaccines from the EU via Northern Ireland into the UK. Now, the EU rode back on that, and the safeguard provisions weren't adopted, but that has obviously caused major difficulty in the implementation of the protocol, because there is a sense that the EU cannot be trusted to necessarily follow its own its provisions in the protocol, and also take on board the position of Northern Ireland. Now, to an extent, that is settling down a little in terms of the UK-EU relationship, but clearly the Commission's actions have caused further concern within Northern Ireland and indeed beyond about the implications of the protocol. And indeed, we've seen increased calls for it to be abandoned in some sections of Northern Ireland politics over the last number of weeks, which has obviously put a political spotlight on the protocol, which not necessarily everybody was anticipating at the beginning of this year. Part of the upshot of all this is that there's now ongoing discussion between the UK and the EU about how some of the disruptive effects of the implementation of the protocol, of Brexit, of the UK leaving the customs union single market can be addressed. So we've got calls for an extension of the grace periods, for example, and that's becoming quite an urgent issue because of how soon, at least the export health certificate and parcels grace periods are coming, or how soon the end of those grace periods is. Okay. Final slide for me is to just bring us up to date as to where we are, at least at the middle of last week. And this was when Maros Sefcovic, the European Commissioner responsible for the implementation of the protocol, and Michael Gove, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, responsible on the UK side of its implementation, met for a second time within a week and adopted a joint declaration or a joint statement on the protocol. Important thing to mention here is that despite the various calls for the protocol to be abandoned, despite the obvious political tensions which exist around its implementation, the focus of the UK government and the EU is on its implementation. The agreed approach to addressing the various challenges around is with and within the protocol. That said, there is a desire or an interest in finding workable solutions on the ground, and that to achieve that, there's going to be joint engagement by the UK and the EU with business groups and civil society. What that will produce is obviously open to question, but certainly the focus is now very much on at least identifying what the issues are and seeing whether solutions can be found to those. We'll see what comes out of that in the coming weeks, because the Joint Committee, the decision-making body with the responsibility for implementation of the protocol, will be meeting before the 24th of February, as it indicates there, to provide the necessary political steer and approval to the work that's being undertaken. Okay, so we'll find out more about what's happening with the protocol in due course. But suffice to say that I think both the UK and the EU recognise that far more work needs to be done on managing the implementation of it. Okay, that's an overview from me as to where things are. I'm sure there'll be issues there which we can pick up on, but I'm now going to hand over to Katie, who's going to be talking through some of these issues in a little bit more detail.
Thank you very much, David. So I have slides, of course. So what I'm hoping to be able to cover now is the question of where we might go. And I thought I would just make the most of the sort of the academic privilege of taking a bird's eye view and thinking about the nature of the problem that we face and quite why it's so knotty and so complicated, and some of the trade-offs that have been calculated behind the protocol. Because I know there's some discussion about alternatives, etc. So just to sort of frame this and just to take a step back, I guess, from the fuzziness around some of the discussion around the protocol, just to think, well, what is the problem that the protocol is trying to address? And this, and I've probably shared this with you before, but this is a very simplistic depiction of the cornerstones of border management. And it doesn't matter what sort of flow you're talking about, but it's particularly true if you have a regulatory border, particularly highly regulated goods, that these principles of border management are reflected in the border regime. So the first question is, well, do we know what's crossing the border? And the second thing is, well, is it allowed to cross the border? And if it isn't, then the entry to the jurisdiction has to be preventable. And so this is the elements of border management that have to be maintained for any border, for any particular flow. When it came to the question of avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland, the really knotty thing is in relation to movement of goods, because you have everything that goes along with that. And essentially what we saw in the backstop, and it seems it's such a blast from the past, but it's worth specifying that in the previous version of the protocol and the withdrawal agreement that was agreed by Theresa May, the backstop had it that essentially you minimize the need to know what's crossing the border, or indeed to be able to prevent entry across the border, by being sure that it meets the criteria for crossing. So the backstop had it that if the future UK-EU relationship wasn't such that you didn't really need a border, it wasn't such that that the Irish border wasn't a question, i.e. that it wasn't close enough to have that border have the need for border controls. Then we had the backstop coming into play, which is essentially that the UK would align with the EU's rules in those areas that relate to border control. Particularly included North-South cooperation and the all-island economy, so it's quite broadly written. So that was the backstop, and we all know the history of the backstop and how it didn't get very far at all, and it was essentially because it was keeping all of the UK aligned with the EU's rules, albeit temporarily, and until the future relationship could avoid the need for that, then this was the case. Now we have the protocol in the withdrawal agreement as negotiated by Boris Johnson, and you can see here that that circle, in terms of making sure that what crosses the border, in this case the Irish land border, meets the criteria for doing so, that this incorporates the whole of the island of Ireland. Now I should say this is specifically for the movement of goods, and hence the complexity of the protocol, which you're all very aware of as regular attenders to the Brexit Clinic. Hence Annex 2 of the protocol, Northern Ireland remains aligned to key parts of the EU acquis to make sure that we are confident that what's crossing the Irish land border is eligible for free circulation within the European single market. It's not the case in relation to services or people, of course, hence the hardening of the Irish land border in that regard. There's a flip side to this, of course, and that is that you need to know what's crossing that external border, and you need to be able to prevent entry if needs be, and hence these new controls and checks down the Irish Sea. And this is what we have the grace periods for, to try and manage that and allow for that implementation rather than the sudden shock. But they when they come to an end, then the imposition of that border will be even more obvious, like the standards and the requirements for goods crossing that border will be rigorously implemented with increased friction as a result of that. And of course, the more Britain, any part of Britain diverges from the EU's rules, the more strict those checks and controls will be. The question is, well, are there alternatives to the protocol? And some of you may have heard last week, Lord Trimble was advocating a report from the Centre for Brexit Policy, which talks about mutual enforcement as an alternative. And funnily enough, we've heard principles of this before. So this was published, or a version of it was published last year, and it's a sort of a rehashing of some principles that even the UK government was mentioning in the early days of Brexit. And I remember talking about these in Brexit clinics in 2017, I think. But essentially what this would do is ignore the need for a border at all. So you can see here that it's talking about the GATT rule that would allow exceptions to be made in terms of border control on the grounds of security. And essentially what it says is that either side of the border, so basically Northern Ireland and Ireland, we would have it that the relevant border authorities will be applying the other side's rules. So essentially you don't have a border. So not only do you not know that what is crossing the border, you can't obviously prevent entry, nor do you know that it meets the criteria for doing so. In fact, you can be pretty sure that it doesn't. So hence on all the cornerstones of border management, this doesn't work. Maybe there's another alternative. Maybe this is where we can think about triggering Article 16. And we've discussed this before. And I think it's just worth stressing that Article 16 is a core element of the protocol because it's designed to uphold the protocol and ensure its endurance, as is the case in all safeguard measures for agreements. They're there to ensure that the agreement will continue. And this is the case with Article 16. If Article 16 was triggered, as there have been calls for it to happen through the UK government, of course, this doesn't mean that the protocol will come to an end or be suspended in any way. A safeguard measure would have to be very specific, and it would be implemented for as short a time as possible after consultation and notification, etc. Now, we're all very aware of the controversy around, as David mentioned, the European Commission's misjudgment. But that's nonetheless, that is in some ways, that's a good example of a safeguard measure because it was quite specific and in response to what they consider to be exceptional circumstances. That's not to justify it by any means at all, but to sort of say that's an example of a safeguard measure that's very specific about a particular type of good. Anyway, suffice to say, if Article 16 was triggered, it would not lead to the collapse of the protocol. It would be designed to ensure that it could endure in the longer term. So where are we at? And as David has mentioned, we have the meeting of the UK-EU Joint Committee, Gove and Sefcovic, next week. And that's because that's where responsibility for the whole of the withdrawal agreement, but the protocol lies as well. That's the body that makes the decisions. And the First Minister and Deputy First Minister can be there by invitation of the UK government, if there's representation from the Irish government there as well. The Specialised Committee is meeting this week, and that is officials from the UK and the EU. Again, officials from Northern Ireland can be there if they're invited by the UK government. And then that's the committee that makes recommendations to the Joint Committee for decisions. And the question is, well, where are they getting that information to make those recommendations to the Joint Committee? You'll have seen that Gove and Šefčovič say they're going to be meeting with civil society and businesses. That's a rather ad hoc way of doing it. And there is a mechanism in the protocol, the Joint Consultative Working Group, terms of reference have now been approved, but that is the formal means by which the UK and the EU should exchange information and engage in consultation around particular issues that will arise regarding the protocol. They may also receive proposals from the North-South Implementation Body and the North-South Ministerial Council, but this is the formal structure. And just for my last slide, I wanted to give a sense of the importance of this joint committee. So it's responsible, as I say, for overseeing the whole of the withdrawal agreement, but that includes the protocol, and it will meet at least 4 times this year. I suspect it may meet more frequently than that, but it has many very important responsibilities, and this includes these 10. Just to give you a sense of the kind of responsibility that it has, it's not intended to be necessarily a responsive body, but in the longer period of time, we can see how wide and significant its scope will be. And I sort of want to stress that because we can see now that this is a UK-EU relationship that is having a direct impact on Northern Ireland, rather than the British-Irish relationship. So it's defining at-risk goods. We saw the decision there in December about this and how to manage that. It may at any time amend its decisions in relation to this. The operation of the UK Trader Scheme, which was a significant development in December, this is meant to be a key means of facilitating the movement of goods from GB into Northern Ireland, and that will be reviewed in 2024. It's also charged with overseeing the facilitation of trade within the UK, and this will be, I suspect, where many of those discussions next week will come. To what degree is the protocol adding friction, unnecessary friction or avoidable friction to trade within the United Kingdom, and to what degree could they avoid controls? And the key element in the protocol is to the extent possible. So essentially they have to have a compromise on that, but that's what those discussions will be about. Also VAT and excises, Northern Ireland is following the EU's VAT rules for goods. So it'll be regularly discussing that. Mixed decision on agricultural support scheme limits, maximum and the minimum. It's overseeing, as we've discussed before, it's charged with maintaining the conditions for North-South cooperation. It's looking at practical working arrangements for the EU presence. We know that the EU observers are present at the border control posts in Northern Ireland. It's charged with overseeing that. Critically, if we have a vote of the Northern Ireland Assembly to no longer continue with Articles 5 to 10, that'll be happening by December 2024. Then the Joint Committee is charged with coming up with the alternative in the space of a couple of years and making that recommendation to the UK and the EU. So a really important job there. It also considers that dynamic alignment, so the adoption of new acts that fall within the scope of the protocol, what that things should do. And it's also, up until the end of 2024, it may adopt decisions that amend the protocol. And this will be something that'll be important to keep an eye on, given that we've seen this happen already, as David has mentioned in the past, and we can expect some such decisions to continue to be made by the UK-EU Joint Committee. So essentially, although we may be tempted by alternatives or think there are quick solutions, in actual fact, it comes down to the fundamentals, which is this is about a UK-EU relationship. We've got huge adjustment in that relationship, and there are mechanisms by which accommodation should be made to each other to ensure that the compromise, awkward as it is, that we see in the protocol continues to work with the best interests of Northern Ireland at heart. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Vivienne now.
Thank you very much. And I also have some slides to share. Okay, so to complement what Katie and David have been discussing, I'm going to look at some specific issues more from an environment agri-food perspective. So complementing David's kind of overview of where we are in the negotiations and Katie's kind of forward-looking bird's-eye view. So there's been a survey by the British Chambers of Commerce that is just recently out looking at what's happening to UK exporters. We're seeing, of course, and I know, I mean, the colors on this graph are quite terrible, but we're seeing here, you can see here in beige, I guess, 25% would say it's still too early to say. But we're seeing a lot of issues, especially around the movement of goods. We're seeing some issues around services. We're not seeing a lot of issues yet on movement of people, but that's also, I mean, of course, we are in a pandemic where the movement of people is severely restricted. So in many ways, I would expect when the pandemic ease that we will see many more issues around the movement of people. But for now, it looks like a lot of the issues are around the movement of goods. And that's can be explained by a whole host of reasons. Part of it is mixed messages from the government, in that it has been quite hard to prepare for something. We were told, businesses were repeatedly told to prepare, but not what for, because of course the agreement, the UK-EU Trade Cooperation Agreement was only signed in late December. Also, of course, the pandemic didn't help in that businesses had to adapt to a very different environment last year, and it was very difficult to adapt for two different challenges at the same time. But more fundamentally, a lot of the businesses that are struggling right now did not necessarily exist before when the UK had very different trading relations with the EU. And that's so a lot of what was feasibly what was doable for these businesses, they were set up in an economic environment that is radically different now, and not it in a way it doesn't matter irrespective of the amount of derogation that can be adopted if this basically has really made a critical challenge for these kind of businesses that really need this kind of open borders to trade. Now, SPS is one of the issues that I was really struggling, not just from the kind of GB to EU trade, but also here in Northern Ireland, getting produce from GB into Northern Ireland and vice versa. So we're seeing here, there's been lots of things reported in the media around issues, for example, around cheese and Brexit. That's one of these key examples where products of animal origins are facing much tougher checks and are going to be facing much tougher checks after the end of grace periods as well. David mentioned 5Ps. If you look at the 5Ps, so SPS as in sanitary and phytosanitary issues, a lot of the 5Ps are actually underpinned by SPS issues. That free movement of animals, including pets, plants and all that. So sorting through SPS issues is critical to easing at the border. And that's also because you need much tougher checks on SPS. And that's for very simple reasons, of course. SPS really matters a lot to, being able to know what kind of goods you have on your market, have traceability. European citizens, European consumers now expect full traceability of their food in many ways. We've had a number of health food scare over the last 20, 30 years that has really made the EU toughen up its system with, of course, the collaboration of the UK in that toughening up. But now, of course, the UK is on the outside of that system, or at least GB is. And that's where we've got a lot of this friction. Now, so today, what we have to see is what is and what is not possible within the protocol, which is why it's really welcome that we have the news that Sefcovic is going to meet with NI businesses and civil society, so hearing directly, and that we're going to have frequent meetings from the different committees under the protocol. But in many ways, you can get some derogation, you can get some grace periods. They may be not just for supermarkets, but for broader businesses. But in many ways, that's not going to be enough. For a lot of these businesses, having this kind of degradation grace period, perhaps even having help with filling in the paperwork, as we're seeing with the UK government doing this movement assistance scheme. So that would allow, it costs about £150. It would allow vets to claim £150 per export health certificate that they have to do for businesses directly to the government, meaning that businesses won't have to pay these export health certificates. Now that's great, but it would still take time to organize the appointments, to set up these meetings. And we can see that a lot of small businesses which would normally have traded with Northern Ireland may just opt not to and focus on the GB market, because even if they don't have to pay extra paperwork, they would still have to arrange this extra paperwork. So then the question is, okay, if we cannot get more grace period within the protocol, and if the measures that the UK can adopt on its own, such as a movement assistance scheme, are not enough, what is the next step? And the next step is the UK government changing its position in terms of the relationship with the EU when it comes to alignment with SPS rules. And we're seeing that there's been a lot of debate on this and how close the UK should be aligned with the EU on SPS rules. In Sefcovic's letter earlier this month, he said around pets travel, for example, talking about flexibility would entail the UK committing to align with relevant EU rules. The fact that the UK has not been willing to align for now, in many ways has been discussed as due to plans for UK-US trade deal. I would suggest that a lot of this alignment, we have to stop thinking of this as a permanent alignment, and there's no UK-US trade deal that is ready to go. So even if we could simplify the solution, the situation by having alignment for a year or two, or even just until a UK-US trade deal is signed, this would already make life easier for a lot of businesses and consumers and just people wanting to travel with their pets. So whether, we have to adopt a more perhaps practical perspective when it comes to SPS alignment. If the EU is willing to consider at least a medium-term commitment to SPS alignment, this would clarify the situation for everyone. Now, it's not just about SPS though. We've heard a lot in the news locally around questions around Lough eels, around the fact that the eels caught in Northern Ireland cannot currently be sold to Great Britain, and that glass eel, so juvenile fish, cannot be imported from Great Britain, grown in Northern Ireland. And this, in a way, goes under this unfettered access commitment in the protocol, but it doesn't really, because the unfettered access commitment comes with a caveat, which is if the EU is bound by international commitments, then that trumps the unfettered access. And the EU is, in this case, bound by the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So we're going to have lots of different cases like this that will, perhaps some are already visible, some will take months perhaps to surface. We don't yet know exactly how it's going to hit. And while an alignment on SPS could perhaps solve the buying cheese online issue, this is much more problematic because, of course, endangered species rules, it would be perhaps much more difficult for the EU to change that kind of rules. Now, we were hearing from both Katie and David around alignment. In many ways, the environment and agri-food issue is also where we're going to see some of the earlier case of alignment, and where we're going to see how the protocol plays out in practice vis-a-vis the common frameworks with GB and within GB, and also the internal market. One of the EU regulations that is included in the Annex 2 of the protocol, so for which Northern Ireland has to keep in line with developments at EU level, is REACH, so the chemicals regulation. There's been a new policy agreed under REACH at EU level to ban the use of lead shots in wetlands. And that has, that is then going to have to apply to Northern Ireland. So this, in a way, will be a key test for Northern Ireland's ability to deliver on that dynamic alignment. With every kind of new pieces of EU legislation like this, you have a period for the member states and now for Northern Ireland as well to implement it. So we'll see, can Northern Ireland actually meet its deadlines? But it will also have ramification inside GB, because we have the Scottish commitment that has in that UK withdrawal from the EU Continuity Scotland Act of 2021 to keep pace. So will Scotland also then ban the use of flat shut in wetlands? Now, and will England and Wales follow suit or not? So that then is going to put pressure on common frameworks around chemicals, but also common frameworks around biodiversity protection, around are we going to see greater divergence within the UK, because on the one hand of the protocol and on the other hand of the Scottish government political commitment to keep pace with the EU. So that's on the protocol, but the protocol is not the only area where we're seeing lots of movement. We're seeing quite a lot of negative movement right now in Westminster, where the UK environmental bill that had been presented by Boris Johnson as a lodestar, as the kind of the pinnacle of his legislative agenda, has yet been pushed back. It had already been much delayed when it was introduced in July 2018, and it has still not finished its parliamentary journey. So we are not sure exactly when it's going to be coming back, potentially the autumn. Now that is problematic for England, because that's where that's a piece of legislation with setting up the Office for Environmental Protection. Formally, it's also very problematic for Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland decided, like the plan is for Northern Ireland to opt in this Office of Environmental Protection, not develop its own environmental regulator from scratch, which is what Wales and Scotland are doing. And now there is also some consequences in many ways for Scotland and Wales, though, because with the bill in 2017, 2018, when Westminster was preparing this bill, they were really rushing ahead, perhaps, of the devolve and trying to kind of set a UK direction of travel. They've really lost the momentum in Westminster, and we're seeing very different approaches now developing in Scotland and Wales. And that could have some knock-on effect on policy development across the UK, if we're seeing now Scotland and Wales as first movers and not London. And so also then back effect on Northern Ireland around perhaps looking more towards what is happening in Cardiff and in Edinburgh, and not so much in London. But more generally, it really shows a difficulty to move beyond these kind of green Brexit slogans to deliver on the Brexit reality. And the issues we're seeing on agri-food right now and SPS are issues I would assume we're going to see on the environmental front in the next few months as well. And that's all for me.
Okay, thanks, Vivian. Thanks, Katie. Excuse me. Let's open up the floor for any comments or questions. I do see there's already a question in the Q&A on the role of the Irish and the Northern Ireland Executive at the Joint Committee, if they're invited to attend, and how will different views within and between these be considered. I'm just going to show you one slide, which I can hopefully share with you. Just to talk through the rules of procedure which the Joint Committee has. What you see here is a key point about the operation of the Joint Committee. Decisions are taken by mutual consent. Okay, so anything that comes out of the Joint Committee has to be agreed, but that's the joint mutual consent of the co-chairs. And it's important here to note who the co-chairs are. They are the member of the European Commission and the representative of the UK government. So Maroš Šefčovič on the part of the European Commission and Michael Gove in terms of the EU. They basically co-chair the meetings. They are the ones who invite people to contribute. None of us have actually seen one of these meetings in operation, but the understanding is that, okay, they are inviting those who are attending to contribute their to the discussions, raise issues, but ultimately the decisions are taken by the co-chairs. So when the Irish representatives are there, where the Northern Ireland executive representatives are there, they are there to be essentially consulted and for their views to be heard. They don't have a decision-making role. The decisions are taken by the co-chairs. I suppose another important point to make about the joint committee, it's very much, as Katie indicated earlier, at the sort of the top of the hierarchy of the institutional framework, and that beneath it you've probably got the meetings which do more of the detailed discussion of the issues at hand. So the specialised committee, and once it's up and running, the joint consultative working group, and that's probably where you get a freer flow of discussion around issues. And I think if in terms of sort of the decisions which the joint committee will ultimately take, if there's going to be serious influence in those, there probably needs to be at the earlier stages of the discussion in those bodies that feed into the joint committee rather than at the joint committee itself. So hopefully that answers a little bit of that question which was posed. I see Vivian's got a cat with her. Very good. Okay. So a couple of questions there in the chat. Is the Northern Ireland Protocol compliant with all three strands of the Good Friday Agreement? Katie.
So it's a good question. And I think just to put it in a broader context, without going too far into it, but I think some of the reaction that we've seen over the past few weeks is part of a consequence of the sense of it being a zero-sum question. So the idea that we have a harder Irish sea border in order to avoid a hard Irish land border. And that zero-sum analysis doesn't really sit very well with the conditions of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. I don't think it certainly, if with regards to the movement of goods, that is what we have. We have those new checks and controls on the Irish sea border to avoid it on the land border. But as I say, the land border will also get harder over time, not least if we think about the consequences of European integration, which was so took a long time, so diverse, so complicated and complex. We have a process now of disintegration rather than integration, and so we will see the consequences of that in a less obvious way, and of course in relation to different flows than the flow of goods. To answer the specific question about whether it's compliant with the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and I hear a lot about the principle of consent. And I think that the key point here is that if you remember back, there was a judgment of the UK Supreme Court in January 2017 that covered this question as to whether it was, whether Brexit itself and taking Northern Ireland outside of the European Union was breaching the principle of consent in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, which is basically that the constitutional status of Northern Ireland can't change without the majority consent of the people there. It was arguing that the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, so the plaintiffs are arguing that the constitutional status of Northern Ireland was changed by Brexit and therefore this was breached. The ruling of the Supreme Court was that that principle of majority consent is specifically about whether Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom or whether it is part of a united Ireland. So I think in relation to that, and I wouldn't see fit to contradict the ruling of the Supreme Court. In that sense, the protocol, of course, it's lesser than the point of Brexit itself. Like the protocol doesn't breach the principle of majority consent because it doesn't change, it doesn't make a united Ireland. Which, just to conclude, I also just want to address that point about whether we have the creation of a united Ireland by stealth. And I would just, I would just say essentially that it would be a mistake to, if we think basically of what we had whilst Northern Ireland and Ireland were jointly in the European Union, essentially, and for those of us who are looking at cross-border cooperation for many years and the impact of European integration, you weren't seeing the creation of a united Ireland. There's a thesis in European integration studies about neo-functionalism, so spillover effects, and i.e. that if you have economic integration, you have political integration. And analysis from the case of Ireland, and experts are writing about this from the early 2000s onwards, was that wasn't really evident, because politics trumps everything else in many ways. And of course, the legal framework hadn't changed. So I think essentially, although we have some potential for the growth of an all-Ireland economy, given that Northern Ireland is in single market for goods, it would just be in some areas rather than others. And this is not by any means to say that you have the creation of a united Ireland, which of course is wholly dependent on whether you have a majority vote for that in a referendum on the topic.
Thanks, Katie. Vivian, is there anything you want to add to that, or to any other questions that you can see coming through on the chat?
Sorry, I had not been looking at the chat directly.
Right.
I think also the allotmenter, what are the trends of being able to get seed potatoes and live plants? I mean, definitely I would assume for the next growing season more than for this one. I would suggest not necessarily planning on getting any plants from GB this time around, because we are seeing, I mean, this is definitely a point that Michael Gove is stressing a lot, but there are reasons why we've got these rules on the EU side. And of course, the UK and Ireland as islands are also have very high level of safety on this. So these are very serious issues. And I think that there may be some options, especially on the seeds, much more perhaps than the seed potatoes and live plants. So yeah, sorry for that waffling answer, but we don't know, but I think we can hope at least some resolution, at least on some of these goods.
I think if I could just come in there, we saw last week before, letters from Michael Gove and from Maroš Šefčovič. I think what was striking is, okay, the UK flagged the seeds question, and Šefčovič responded and acknowledged there was an issue there. So it's something which I think they realise they probably need to resolve. Whether they can or not is another matter. If you go back to before Christmas, the seed question was not on the agenda. It is now. So it'll be interesting to see what comes through. I see that there's a question in there about GB businesses and overcoming the obstacles for trading with Northern Ireland. I think we made the point earlier that a lot of the information about the new arrangements from the 1st of January and how they were going to operate was only provided very late in the day. I think it's fair to say a lot of that information was essentially provided to Northern Ireland consumers and businesses, and there wasn't an effective process of educating GB suppliers to the new arrangements. And that has been, I think, recognised, and the understanding is there are efforts to try and increase the available information and educate, whether that be through government activity or whether it be through the professional associations, whether it be through businesses here alerting GB suppliers to the arrangements in place to move goods to Northern Ireland. I think there's also another dimension which we sometimes overlook, and that is that within the EU, there's not necessarily an awareness of the fact that, okay, you can move goods to Northern Ireland as if Northern Ireland were in the internal market, that the arrangements which apply to Great Britain do not apply to Northern Ireland, although there are obviously difficulties around moving goods via the land bridge. But I think that there is a learning process ongoing, and a recognition that a lot of the information which should have been made available wasn't made available, and wasn't made available to the people who possibly most needed it. People are beginning to understand a little bit more the arrangements. Okay. Does anybody want to take a stab at the decimalisation question, weights and measures? No, I think we'd have to come back to you on that one if we can think of an answer. Katie?
I mean, to be fair, I don't see the UK making changes. So it is an interesting what if, but I would assume that the UK is not ready to reverse 50 years of decimalisation. But then, I'm French and I'm still really struggling with the weird weight and measures you have in this country. So I would assume it would be actually better to go and push towards a greater alignment, at least for Northern Ireland, with proper weights and measures adopted in the rest of the world.
I mean, I wouldn't say so. If the UK, so of course the UK is outside of the Eurozone, of course, and so there'll be nothing in the protocol to stop a change to Northern Ireland's currency if the UK decided to go that way. There was a question on whether any VAT collected on in Northern Ireland goes to the EU, and the answer is no. That's quite clear. And then in relation to alternative arrangements that we might hear about, I suspect, I mean, what's interesting is that, and I did a slightly, I tweeted on it the other day about these smart solutions, and you're not hearing about them in relation to the sea border. In relation to the sea border. And I think this is partly because they're often coming from people who would prefer to have seen a land border, which is perfectly within their right to think that. But it's also because smart solutions and the technological solutions, again, what you've heard me talk about in the past, I mean, they don't deal with regulatory divergence. So those kind of things that Vivienne was talking about in relation to, checking to see whether beef burgers really do contain beef and not horse meat, etc. Those kind of things you can't get technological, invisible, frictionless solutions to. Although that said, there are some elements of the use of technology that are at work in managing the sea border, and they could be much more usefully rolled out. And there is, for all the talk of taking back control of borders, etc., we do see that the UK is not very advanced in its use of border control. So it's talking a lot, there's a lot of jargon around it, but in terms of practicalities, so which basically rely on cross-border communication and cooperation amongst agencies. We're seeing very minimal amount of that at the moment from the UK side. There's a big scope for better practice in that regard, so-called single window for customs, etc. So there's a long way to go yet that could, in means of helping to reduce some of the friction experienced on the sea border. But ultimately, if you have a regulatory border, you do need those checks and controls.
Just picking up on some of the other questions in the chat. Is there a realistic prospect of the DUP bringing down Stormont over the protocol? I think you'll have to ask the DUP about that one. In terms of derogations, the question there, can you say anything about derogations in the protocol, for example, in terms of derogations that may have been given to the UK as member state prior to Brexit, do also the scope of the Northern Ireland to derogate in any amendment to the EU regulations in the future? I suppose a quick comment there on what was agreed in December, particularly around the grace periods. Let's note that those are based on unilateral declarations of the UK government and a response on the part of the EU. They are not a legally binding derogation from EU law. And I think that's indicative of the way in which we're probably going to see this protocol implemented, that if there are going to be easements, it's not going to be reflected in any changes to the protocol. It's going to be on arrangements around the implementation of it. Now, could be proved wrong. There may be, the political climate at the moment may see a slight shift in that, but the indications are at the moment that the language of the protocol is not going to be changed. We will see. I think also what's worth noting in those is that in that protocol, in the grace periods on two of them, the UK, as part of the arrangement, took a unilateral decision to maintain alignment with the EU acquis, a recognition of the realities around implementation. And we're probably going to see, I would have thought, if there are going to be further grace periods that the EU will expect something similar to happen from the UK there. In terms of future regulations, okay, there's obviously amendments to and replacements to measures included in the Annex 2 and other parts of the agreement automatically apply under the protocol. But if there's a new piece of EU law that the EU believes should be covered by the protocol, should be implemented in respect of Northern Ireland, then that has to be by joint agreement of the UK and the EU in joint committee. Now, as part of the process of reaching agreement on that, there will be dialogue, there will be discussions within the joint committee, the specialised committee, and the joint consultative working group, and whether there may be some adjustments to it to reflect the Northern Ireland position, we just don't know. But this is where we're going to have to see how the management of the protocol plays out in the coming weeks and months and years. Okay. I don't know, Katie, Vivian, any of those questions you want to come in on? You see,
there's a question on EU citizenship rights of Irish citizens in Northern Ireland, and without getting into too much detail, it's just sort of worth distinguishing between those rights of EU citizens. So Irish citizens in Northern Ireland are EU citizens still, but there's a difference between your rights that you can enjoy outside or out with the European Union and those that you can enjoy in the European Union. And so, for example, Irish citizens still enjoy the freedom of movement that EU citizens have, so the right to go and live and work and study in an EU country. But some of the detailed aspects of EU citizenship, for example, in relation to workers' rights or those kind of elements, those aren't protected anymore. So this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of the level playing field arrangements that we saw touched upon in the TCA, and was a huge amount of contention because of the sense that the EU therefore had a reach to sort of direct how much the UK could lower or change its standards in these areas, and workers' rights, labour rights are included as part of a level playing field issue, but it doesn't prevent the UK from adjusting them. And so it's just, so it is sort of worth bearing in mind there's a distinction between those citizenship rights that you can enjoy outside of the European Union, which are minimal, and those that you then can benefit from if you leave, if you go into the EU.
Okay, thanks, Katie. There's a question in there, how do we see post-Brexit European integration for Northern Ireland? Don't know, Vivian, you've got a comment on that one? Or?
I mean, I think there it's really hard to know, but I think we're going to see kind of sectoral differences, like key sectoral differences in terms of the level of integration. There are issues of that on goods, for example, because we have some goods and supply chains, if the arrangements hold firm and that it is easy to continue to operate, for example, dairy businesses, agri-food businesses on an all-island basis, I think you could see potentially more integration in these areas. I think, of course, I mean, the movement from the Irish government around questions around Erasmus means we could also have, in terms of young people here, perhaps definitely more integration than you would have for students in GB, although there's movement as well in Scotland. So I guess the big thing is that the different parts of the UK will have, I would assume, a growingly different and diverging relationship with the EU. You're not going to have one UK-EU relationship. You're going to have a Scottish EU relationship, a Welsh EU relationship, and an NI-EU relationship. The NI-EU one has the potential to be the closest, but it also has the potential to be the most conflictual. And that's where I think there's a lot of uncertainty. It could really go either way.
Katie, do you want to come in on this one? Okay, I suppose the point that I would add, and I think reinforces what Vivian's saying there, is that you've got the UK-EU relationship. As part of that, you've got the Northern Ireland Protocol, which singles out Northern Ireland for some differentiated treatment. Now, as it stands, that's been quite clearly delineated in terms of the content of the protocol. It's not necessarily presented as something which is going to see Northern Ireland diverge further from the UK as a consequence of what's in the protocol. That said, there's provisions in there about North-South cooperation. There are the overarching objectives of the protocol, and if there were political will on the part of the two sides to pursue some arrangements which might see Northern Ireland involved more in activities with the EU, then arguably the framework is there to facilitate that. But it doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's a foregone conclusion that will be the case. I think all this is going to be the subject of negotiation and discussion, and presumably those negotiations and discussions will take place in a context which is sensitive to what the wishes are of people on the ground. We will see, but there is a framework of sorts there. Okay, I'm very minded we've got about 2 minutes left. Final word, Katie, Vivian? Particularly mindful of, I think the very final question down there is it a case of we just have to get on with the job of making the arrangements work?
So we do have a challenge in that the EU will always be emphasizing the rigorous implementation of the protocol because all its member states, and some large ones included, are very concerned that Northern Ireland is a weak spot now in the single market. So we can expect to see the EU being careful not to trumpet the idea of flexibility very publicly, and it will be careful to be sure that the rules are being implemented here. On the other hand, the UK will constantly downplay the significance of the protocol. So we have that sort of public discourse that they're meeting very different objectives. But in the middle, we have the responsibility for the protocol, the purpose of the protocol, which is obviously to respect the unique circumstances on the island of Ireland, and that includes Northern Ireland's very close links and integration with Britain as well as with Ireland. And so, or ever the optimist, you would hope that through these proper use of those mechanisms for deliberation and dialogue and consultation, that joint decisions will be made that do continue, as need be, continue to flow, to show flexibility and imagination on both sides.
Vivian, anything?
We need to get on with it, but it's wrong to say that we, the impression that we already have the rules and now we just need to apply them correctly is wrong, because we don't have our common frameworks. We are still missing a lot of the key Brexit legislation in Westminster. So we are still in this process of flux, and it's not just about implementing, it's still about fighting some of these legislative battles to at least try to have the protocol in mind when we're agreeing these kind of GB rules.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there. Just gone over quarter to two. Can I thank everybody for participating, for coming along today, for the questions you posed, and to listening to the three of us try and provide answers to the various questions which have been flagged. There will be more questions in due course, and as we're committed to, we're going to continue with holding these post-Brexit clinics at hopefully a fairly regular on a regular basis throughout this year, and it did over the coming years. So thanks very much. We'll be in touch about dates of the next one, and in the meantime, yeah, enjoy following the trials and tribulations of the protocol and the UK-EU relationship now that we're very much in the land of real Brexit. So thanks very much, everyone, and take care.